I want you to consider, does only bad things happen to unbelievers? And does only constantly good things happen to God's people? Well, the answer is no. No, that's not how the world works. Because we're going to find that, there's a couple that here in the Proverbs, there's Proverbs that tell us how life should be, how things should happen, but they don't always happen that way. That in the first Proverbs we're going to see this morning that it speaks of the reward, the righteous are rewarded, and it's speaking of this earth, and the wicked are the ones that be punished, or evil come upon them. But then also we find 2 verses later that the poor, they lack food not because of laziness or because of that there's not enough, but because of injustice that happens. And so there's different kinds of proverbs we find. Some that will tell us how life should be and how things ought to be for the wicked and for the righteous. We find other proverbs that are commands. Obviously, a fear of the Lord. That's a command to fear God and to turn away from sin. And then there's other proverbs that are wisdom ones that it's going to take wisdom to see that is this what I should do rather than an absolute command that this must be done, and that if you don't do it, then you are sinning. But we're going to see that these several different kinds of proverbs this morning that where how life should be, but it not always is going to be like that. And as well as wisdom, that then leaving an inheritance is that example when I said that is of wisdom, where must a believer always leave an inheritance, financial inheritance, even up to their grandchildren? And then as well as that we see injustice is done for the poor and what we ought to be doing. But first, let's look at the rewards of the righteous and versus the rewards of the wicked. Verse 21. Adversity pursues sinner in Proverbs 13:21. Sinners, but the righteous will be rewarded with prosperity. This is what I was talking about, that adversity pursues sinners, but the righteous will be rewarded with prosperity. This is how reality should be, that adversity should pursue sinners, righteousness should be rewarded with prosperity. And so we first find adversity pursuing sinners. The idea is that trouble hunts down the wicked like the avenger of blood in the Old Testament. The avenger of blood was one who, if one of their family members was murdered, God had said that they could avenge that murder and track down the murderer. And so adversity is supposed to hunt them down like that. Or evil pursues after the wicked like a detective who is trying to solve a case and trying to find the person who committed them, to punish them. Or as a hunter pursuing after an animal that they're wanting to hunt and track them down. Psalm 140 verse 11, may a slander not be established in the earth. May evil hunt the violent man speedily. So this psalm, just like this proverb said, that the wicked are the ones to be punished. That bad things are supposed to happen to them because you reap what you sow. And you are to reap what you sow. But we know biblically speaking that you often reap later than you sow. and more than you sow, but it comes not always right away. Even though we wish that the wicked would be punished right away. And there's plenty of examples in the scriptures when the wicked got what they deserved and were punished pretty soon after what they've done. Achan did not obey God. God had gave the command to Joshua when they went to Jericho that when God brought the walls down after they had marched the 7 times and shouted and blasted trumpets, the walls came down, that they were to burn everything. And the precious metals, like gold and silver and bronze, were to be brought into the treasury of the Lord. But what did Achan do? He coveted, he saw, and he took things and hid them. And it cost men their lives in battle. And even then, he didn't confess until the next day when the lot fell upon him. He had an opportunity to confess along the way when Joshua announced, God said, tomorrow, this is what's going to happen. And so he had all night to think about that. And in the morning, when they brought a head of each tribe, the lot fell to his tribe. And then it kept on going through multiple, down to from the households, from the family groups, the households, and then to just him and his family, going down to these, from larger groups down to smaller. And he had every opportunity along the way to confess his sin. But he got what happened to him for disobeying. His sin found him out, and he and his family and all he owned was burned, and was stoned, and then burned. Wicked Jezebel eventually got what she deserved. She was killed at God's command. The wicked men who tried to get Daniel killed in the lion's den, they got what they deserved the next day. Korah in the wilderness rebelled against God and Moses and led others into rebellion. And the earth swallowed him up and his family and his tents, and they went alive into the earth. Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood that wiped out of all mankind except for Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives and the animal on the ark. And there's probably modern day examples you can think of, people getting caught and got what they deserved. Look again at Proverbs 13:21 with me. Adversity pursues sinners, but the righteous reward with prosperity. And God does bless his people. Righteousness reward prosperity. He promised to take care of us. That word prosperity does not mean as what we always will think of when, or how even false teachers will use it of, that God wants you to be wealthy. He wants you to be having a mansion, for every believer, that prosperity gospel that's out there. And the only people that get rich with the prosperity gospel are the ones who teach it and take money from people and leave others poor. But God promised to take care of his people. And he does take care of us. He takes care of us with what we need. And so that word for prosperity means what is good. It can also mean what is good. And I think of God's promise in Matthew 6:33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. And so God promised to take care of his people. But there are people who God blesses with wealth. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon. I think of modern examples of Hobby Lobby, and then even Truett Cathy, I think, he's now passed away, of Chick-fil-A, that blessed, and they gave away money. I believe it was the man that started Colgate was he gave away, I think, 90% of what he made, and so God blessed him. One that made machinery. I can't remember his name, but I think of him when he said that, that he talked about how that he had a shovel and just he would give away, but God had a bigger shovel and blessed him. And so he was another man that gave away the majority of what he made to God's kingdom. And so God does bless people, but he does not promise to bless everyone. But he gives us what we need. He provides for what we need. When you walk in his ways, it's a life that is blessed and used for God's glory. And this is not a promise that we're going to have wealth and mansions on this side of heaven. We're going to have eternal blessings, eternal riches, not like what we think of, but we have a place waiting for us, eternal riches that we'll have. And so I asked you to consider earlier that do bad things happen to the wicked? Only bad things, I should say. And only good things happen to the righteous. And we said no. I mean, Asaph in the Psalms, Psalm 73 wrote this, that, "For I was envious of the arrogant as I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there are no pains in their death, and their body is fat. They are not in trouble as other men, nor are they plagued like mankind." And so we have to consider that not good only, we can't come to the conclusion that only good happens to the righteous and only evil. Because we have to be careful. Because if we think that only the ungodly, they're the only ones that have troubles in their lives, they're the only ones that have bad things happen to them, then only good things will happen to the godly people, then we're going to make the mistake of Job's friends. Over the course of from chapter 4, over the course of 20 chapters, from chapter 4 to 24 in Job, you have this dialogue between Job and his three friends who are accusing him of doing wrong, that, Job, you need to repent. This is why this has happened to you. God would not let this happen to a righteous person. And so Job, because God doesn't do that, then you must be a wicked sinner. You have done something so awful. That's why your 10 children are dead. That is why you have this disease on you now. This is why you lost all your wealth. I mean, they kept on telling them that. But they were mistaken. They were mistaken that the righteous do not suffer and bad things don't happen. I mean, Job 22 verse 5 is one of these verses that of his friends. "Is not your wickedness great and your iniquities without end?" Job, this is why this is happening. The apostles made the same mistake. John 9, 2-3. "And the disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?' And Jesus answered, 'It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him.'" That it was not a specific sin of his parents. And it's especially ridiculous to think that it would be this man's born blind because of some sin he committed in the womb. Or maybe they had a future sin, perhaps, in mind. But no. And there are those today in the church who think the same thing. They think that way because they've been lied to by their leaders and so-called pastors who twist Scripture out of context. That there's Christians who think that if you are living for God, you will never get sick. You won't get cancer. You won't have bad things. But, if you get cancer and if you get sick, then you must have done something wicked and awful, and you need to repent and confess that. And so Scripture's twisted out of context. That's not how That's not how life works when we're in a sin-cursed world. And it's easy to make that mistake because a life lived in wickedness does bring trouble. However, there are times when the rich and powerful get away with their wickedness and man's justice system. They either get completely off or they'll get light sentences and hardly a punishment. And they also seem to prosper at the time. That's why Asaph wrote what he did. That, look, Lord, that the wicked, I looked at their lives. They don't seem to have any problems. And we do see that at times. And the truth is that godly people do suffer. Whether that's for Christ and the gospel, because Paul wrote to Timothy, 2 Timothy 2:3, suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. And we know the things that Paul went through. I mean, he was shipwrecked, he was beaten, he was stoned, he was thrown in prison. And so suffering happens when he was doing what was pleasing to the Lord. Trials come, suffering comes. Believers get sick, they get cancer. Not because of some disease. Not because of some particular sin. Some people God will punish if they're unrepentant. He may give a sickness to. But we can't say that is absolute across the board. That because there are those who are living godly, living for the Lord, and they get cancer. They get other diseases, persecution, mocking. Things stolen, being lied about, happen. These things happen. James 1:2-4 tells us this, when those things do happen. That's why the Bible said suffering comes. It's not all, that only prosperity or only good as we would define it. That's why James says, consider all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Count all joy. But there is coming a day when there will be no more sorrow, or sickness, or suffering. And God will reward his people. Matthew 10:41-42. He who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whoever in the name of a disciple gives to one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward. And Hebrews 6:10. For God is not unjust to so as forget your work and the love which you have shown towards his name, in having ministered and in still ministering to the saints. That God will not forget. There are times where he rewards us now in this life, but there's certainly in the next. And God is gracious to you and I, even to give us rewards and blessings and things, because even at our best, all we can ever do is claim we did everything we were supposed to. Just as Jesus said in Luke 17:10, so you too, when you do all things which are commanded you, say, we are unworthy slaves, we have done only that which we have ought to have done. And yet we have a gracious God who gives us blessings and rewards, gives us things far beyond what we ever deserve. And then there's coming a day, not just for the righteous, but there's coming a day for the wicked, when the wicked will not get away with their wickedness anymore. There are times when, yes, they're punished in this life, and they don't get away with it. And there's other times when they do, and things don't happen to them, and it seems like all goes well for them. But whether things go well for them, or they are punished in this life, that where adversity does come upon them, and pursues them, because you do reap what you sow. And things do come upon certain people. But there's coming a day in the future when all will be punished. Revelation 21:8. But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Galatians 6:7-8. I've hinted at this verse. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And so consider today, are you living for God and His glory? Are you walking in His ways? Even when things get hard and when suffering and trials come, do not think, well, what's the use? Why should I serve God? No, we should whether we have in times of blessing, and we would say prosperity, or in times of suffering and trials, we ought to continue walking in God's ways. And then also, we ought to be warning people to turn from their sin because of that day that is coming. We proclaim the gospel to people to turn from their wickedness. And so wisdom for our life is that we need to take things in balance, that we understand that not only good things happen to righteous and only bad things. There are times, as we see, that we ought to walk God's ways even when life gets hard and there's suffering trials. And so wisdom for this life is also wisdom that we find in verse 22 of Proverbs. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner stored up for the righteous. You know, in ancient Israel, it was seen as a blessing from God to be able to leave an inheritance to your child as well as to grandchildren. I mean, Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, Job to his family. Perhaps Abraham gave something to Jacob because when you read the Bible and in Genesis, it appears that Abraham dies before Jacob's ever born. But that's not the case. It's just the purpose is just to finish up with Abraham's life. This is how he lived for the Lord and walked in his ways. But Jacob was, I think, 20 years old before Abraham had passed away. And so you see that they were able to leave something for their families and their children, and perhaps even something for their grandchildren. But don't take this as a command that you must leave an inheritance to your children and to your grandchildren, because there are many proverbs that are just sayings that represent wisdom for a godly life. And so it is a blessing to do this, but there needs to be a carefulness and balance of leaving an inheritance. Because think about how often has money caused problems for the rest of caused problems in a family. After a person's dead, there's fighting. I've known of families that some of the children and grandchildren had nothing to do with their parent or grandparent until they were close to death. Then they're around just to get an inheritance. I've seen that happen and heard of that happening. I mean, there's examples where money and possessions have turned away people from walking with the Lord. The person's died, they thought they were doing a good thing for the person, and that person took that and their heart turned from God. I mean, today is different from the way things were in the past. In the past, families lived with each other and they had little. And so they passed that down, kept that in the family, and to help. But today, things are different. Now, people have homes of their own, have their own places, they have many possessions. And so it takes wisdom in this area. They look at their character. They look how they live and what they can handle, and sometimes you can't leave. You would like to leave the same amount for everyone. But some people can handle more than another person. So you must pray carefully and you consider the things. Look at their character, how they lived, what they can handle. And it takes wisdom, it takes prayer, it takes thought. And also you may want to consider leaving something to the local church or other worthy ministries. Because don't think that they'll do that for you. I've seen that happen where they make promises, yes, oh yes. And they never did. They never honored that after the person died. There's no guarantees. They didn't keep fulfilling the wishes and keep supporting the ministries that person did after they died. And so some people, it's going to take wisdom in this area. But there's something far greater than possessions, money, a house, a home, or any of those things. It's a godly example. It's a life of integrity. That's far greater than money or any of those things. A life lived well, even in the midst of suffering. Even in the midst of suffering, a life lived well. And that is something that you don't have to do, that's not limited just to children, your children and grandchildren, but the example to your whole family, example to your church family, example to the young children who come here. They see a life lived well, even suffering and sickness. A life lived well, and that is far greater. It will have a greater impact in eternity. And so what will you leave behind on this earth? Is it just possessions? Or is it possessions and also, more importantly, godliness? Godly example of seeing your life lived well for the Lord. And that will encourage them thinking, my grandmother, my grandfather, they lived for God. I saw what they had gone through. I looked at their lives, and they had joy. And I've seen what they have, and I want to follow after example. So leave behind a godly example. Well, let's look at example again. Look at verse 22. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of sinners stored up for the righteous, or the wealth of an unbeliever stored up for the righteous. This proverb is stating that when the wicked store up their wealth, they think they're doing so for their families, or for their own pleasure later in their lives. But however, the wicked will have what is taken away from them. And it's not always just in this life. There are times where it will be given to the righteous. Sometimes that happens. There's examples in the Bible of Laban, where God took from Laban and gave to Jacob because of what Laban was trying to do, changing his wages multiple times and tricking him. The spoils of Egypt were given to Israel when they left in the Exodus. Because think about, where do you think all the gold and the silver and bronze and the materials for the tabernacle came from? It came from Egypt being given to the Israelites. Now, God didn't take everything from Israelites, but they gave out of what they had been given by the Egyptians. And so they plundered Egypt. Haman's property was transferred to Mordecai and Esther's care. But that doesn't happen always. That doesn't happen for, I should say, that doesn't happen for every single unbeliever. That when they die, their wealth automatically goes to some believer. That doesn't always happen like that. But there's times where it does. Even in modern examples, I think of in some of the former communist countries that were against Christianity. Communism and being against religions, especially Christianity, go hand in hand. And so they would persecute the church, persecute believers. But then, when those governments are no more, I know of examples of where those buildings, where they would have their wicked government, the government buildings, now there are churches or church ministries in there, like orphanages or churches in there. And so God gave that to them. And now God is being worshipped there rather than persecution being planned and wickedness. I can think of examples in my own life where unsaved peoples, they spend lots of money on something and then they no longer want it. And it's something that my family and I need at the moment. And so they sell it to us at a fraction of the price or just give it to us. And you probably can think of examples of that too in your life. Where God has blessed you and given to you. But we know ultimately that their wealth will not save them. And in God's providence and His timing, He does take from them and hands it over to His people to further the gospel and to further His kingdom. But we must honor God with what He has given to us and honor Him in all our ways. And then look at verse 23 with me. Abundant food is in the fallow ground of the poor, but is swept away by injustice. We have seen throughout the Bible scriptures, and especially seen through the Proverbs, that there are many different ways and reasons that somebody can be poor. Laziness, wastefulness, being irresponsible, daydreaming, overspending, and the list can go on. However, the Bible speaks of other ways that a person can be poor that's not their own doing. Poverty even when working hard. The Bible speaks of the rewards of hard work, and that person should expect to eat from the fruit of their hard work. And we have seen that through the book of Proverbs. Previous verses describe the lazy person goes hungry, while the wise and diligent is rewarded by their hard work, and they have plenty to eat. Proverbs 10:4-5. Poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a son who acts wisely, but he who sleeps in harvest is the son who acts shamefully. That's the way the things should work. That those who are negligent are the ones who should suffer hunger, while those who are diligent should be the ones that eat and have enough to satisfy their hunger and even to share if they share with others. But in this passage, it is the poor person who is diligent, works hard, and is left with little. It's not because of laziness. It's not because there is a lack of food or a famine that's spoken of here, even though those things can happen. It's because of injustice. Injustice. It's swept away like a flood by injustice. And this is either describing the person's small lands and properties of the poor that grow enough food, and then it's taken away from them. Or during the sabbatical year, every 7 years, the Jews were commanded by God in ancient Israel to not prune, not to plant, anything. Just leave the land be. And God had promised them, because they're going to think, whoa, wait a minute here. Wait a minute here, Moses, because that's who's telling them. The Lord told Moses, tell that to them. Well, what are we going to eat then for a whole year? If we're not planting, if we're not picking from the vines of grapes or any other fruits, figs and dates and olives, and planting wheat and barley, what are we going to eat then? And God said, if you obey me, in the 6th year, I'll give you enough for 3. That not only it'll last through the 6th year, the 7th year, and even through the 8th when you're planting. If you obey me, I'll bless you so much that you'll have to get rid of the old to make room for the new. And so if they did that, God blessed them, and what lied fallow and grew on its own was enough to provide food for the poor and others, like animals even, including. But through injustice, it swept away. Maybe by those not obeying this and observing this. Or by wicked rulers, because that's the reality of the cursed world. That there are those who just take. Those who are in power, influential, will just take from those who work hard. And it doesn't even have to be from those who are powerful. The lazy and dishonest can steal from their neighbors. Employers can unjustly not pay their workers by withholding their paychecks. A person can work hard and have little show for it because of injustice. In many other different ways. Or even high taxes, too, that sweep away things today. Matthew 26:11. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. There will always be those who are poor. And we ought to be helping them as we're able to. I mean, 1 John speaks of if you see your brother and that person has a need, and you just say, be full, be well, that even James, I should say, speaks of that same thing. That does not honor and please God. That is sin. If you have it and you're able to help someone, then you should do it. Help those. And we help those, especially Christians, and we help those who are not lazy. Because the Bible also says, if a man shall not work, neither shall he eat. And it's talking about those who refuse to, who have the ability to work, but don't work. They refuse to do so. I'm not talking about those who are looking for a job, those who have the ability to work, but they can't find a job. That's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people, they just don't even want to look for a job. They don't want to do it. They don't care. That's who we should be reluctant to help. But we help, but there are many other people who do need our help. And it's going to take wisdom. And if we're uncertain whether we should help someone or not, I should say, if we're uncertain whether we're not entirely sure of the situation, then we should probably pray about that and err on the side of caution and help. But then if we find out that person's somebody who's lazy and refused to work, who only wants to live off of other people, then we don't no longer help, except tell them they need to get right with the Lord. But it's going to take wisdom, because not everybody who is standing on the street needing help are those who need help. And they ruin it for other people who truly need help. They ruin it. There's those who, they do that because they know they can make more money panhandling than actually a job. And they take advantage of that when there are those who really do need help, and who are hungry and things. And so what I try to do as well, even on the side of caution, is if this person is truly hungry, then I will go and get them something, even maybe ask them what they would like, if there's what's nearby, or take them there. Those are things to consider. Those aren't commandments that you must do as I do, but just something that you can see as an example of what would be wise. And so Proverbs is a book of wisdom. There are examples we see of how life should be, but it not always is like that. But we need God's wisdom to know the differences, that the situations that we see, that yes, the righteous are the ones that should have only good happen to them, but that's not always the way it is. And the same way as well as not everybody who is poor is because they're lazy. It's because of wickedness and injustice and things like that. And we need the Lord's grace and help